The nights on Timber Ridge were always bitter, but that night cut deeper than most. The wind howled through the mountain gaps like the cries of souls that never found rest. Out of that heavy blackness, a figure jerked awake from a shallow sleep. Cold sweat slid down his temple, his hand instinctively clutching the rifle that never left his side. He had heard something footsteps crunching faintly over dead leaves outside the rough-hewn cabin porch. His heart hammered against his ribs, his mind rushing back to nights on the battlefield, when the smallest sound could mean death. But when Caleb Mercer pulled open the heavy door, nothing waited for him but the endless dark and the moaning wind. No intruder, no enemy, just emptiness, and the silence of a man who hadn't believed in miracles for a long, long time. Before we dive deeper into this story, let me pause for a moment. If these opening lines stirred something in you, if you feel the pull of curiosity about a man carrying the scars of war, living alone in a wilderness that barely forgives, don't forget to like this video and share in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Your small gestures of support are the firewood that keeps these long tales alive. And I promise Caleb's journey won't remain in silence. Destiny will come knocking, and with it, choices that turn survival into something far more powerful. Arizona Territory, October 1881. Winter had arrived early, laying thick frost across the ridge and drowning the valley in fog. Caleb's cabin stood pressed against a steep rise, half a day's ride from the small town of Dry Creek. It wasn't a home so much as a fortress, a place to keep the world out. Caleb Mercer, a war veteran who had survived the blood-soaked fields of the Civil War, carried wounds that time never healed. His left knee locked stiff, aching with each step, a reminder carved deep into his body. But the ache in his soul was worse. He had once had a younger brother, barely 20, killed by a stray bullet in the chaos of battle. Caleb, the elder brother who had sworn to protect him, had been forced to lift the boy's lifeless body under a storm of gunfire. Since that day, screams had haunted his dreams. Every crack of twig or whisper of branch at night dragged him back to that field of horror. That was why he had fled to Timber Ridge, away from towns, away from people, away from himself. 3 years slipped by in repetition, setting traps, splitting wood, tending fires. No visitors, no voices, just the wind clawing the shutters and the wolves howling in the cold. Caleb didn't seek friendship. He no longer dreamed of love, loneliness. He decided, never betrayed. But it killed all the same. It gnawed at his memories, hollowed his chest, and drowned him in silence. He lived with discipline like armor. Dawn meant walking the snare line. Evening meant stacking logs by the stove. At night, he wrapped himself in a coarse blanket, rifle within arm's reach, waiting for restless sleep. And always, dreams broke the rhythm, not with comfort, but with blood, gunfire, faces long gone. In town, Dry Creek folks whispered about him. No one remembered him smiling. No one remembered him talking much at all. They knew his limp, his stone-hard stare, and his strange habit of buying the same 3 things each trip: salt, powder, and flour. Then he'd vanish into the trees like a ghost. To most, Caleb Mercer was a relic of a war everyone wanted to forget, a soldier still alive, but buried all the same. Yet fate has a way of shaking even the most closed lives. Just when a man convinces himself that his days hold nothing but silence, something unexpected breaks through. For Caleb, it would begin with a cry in the forest. A sound that wasn't wolf or wind, but human-piercing, desperate. A discovery that seemed like chance, but would alter everything that followed. And that, friends, is where the real story begins. That morning, Caleb Mercer limped along the familiar trail where he'd set his snares. The sky was still heavy with fog, frost clinging in patches across brittle grass. His left knee burned with every step. But pain was nothing new. He carried it the way one carries a shadow, All he expected was a rabbit or two, maybe enough to smoke and hang for another week. But at the 5th snare, he stopped. Not because of game, because of a sound. A breath. Harsh. Ragged. Not animal. Not wind human. Caleb brushed back the thicket, and the sight froze in his mind. Forever. A young Apache woman lay collapsed in the dirt, her leg caught in the iron grip of his own trap. Her eyes blazed wide with panic. Long black hair tangled with dry leaves, skin marked with blood and bruises, her deerskin dress torn and hanging loose from one shoulder, the snare bit deep into her ankle, flesh raw and bleeding. She clawed weakly at the earth, trying to wrench herself free. But the rope only cut tighter. That look terror mixed with despair was one Caleb knew too well. He had seen it in the faces of men dying on battlefields, men who knew no one would carry them home. But this wasn't war. No bugle, no gunfire. Just him. And a woman snared in silence. She saw him, and the terror sharpened. To her, he wasn't rescuer, he was hunter. Her trembling hand snatched up a small stone and raised it like a weapon. Pitiful, yes, but her eyes said she would fight him to the death if he came any closer. Caleb froze, his own hand resting near his rifle. The old soldier in him whispered to stay ready, to strike before danger struck him. But another voice buried deep, raw from memory, rose up, "Don't let another die in front of you." Caleb. Slowly, he crouched and drew his knife. She let out a strangled cry, her whole body taut with fear. But Caleb didn't raise the blade toward her. Instead, he bent low and sawed the rope clean through. The snare snapped open with a dry pop, and blood surged dark around her ankle. She jerked backward, trying to crawl away, but her strength collapsed. The stone slipped from her hand, clattering uselessly in the dirt. She fell limp, gasping. Caleb stood still, torn. He could leave her. Let the wolves come by nightfall. It would be the easier road, the sensible one for a man who'd sworn off trouble. Yet memory gnawed him raw, his brother's body in his arms. A boy too young, left to die with no one to save him. He saw that same abandonment in the Apache girl's face. The hesitation lasted only a breath. Caleb stooped, slid his arms under her, and lifted her frail but heavy body. Immediately she fought him, fists striking weakly at his chest, her breath sharp with panic. His jaw tightened, his bad knee screamed with every step, but he held her firm. Her body stiffened, then sagged, breath shallow against his shoulder. The cabin rose from the trees like a lone sentinel. Smoke still trailed from the chimney. Caleb shouldered the door open and carried her inside. Warmth hit them both in a wave. Her eyes darted, wild and wary, as he laid her onto the rough-hewn bed and pulled a blanket over her shaking legs. The fire popped in the stove, the only sound between them. He said nothing, turned his back, fetched bandages and a basin of water. She tracked him with sharp, frightened eyes, every motion measured like she expected betrayal at any moment. That little cabin had become a battlefield of its own, one man's fear of letting anyone close, one woman's terror of every man she'd ever known. Between them, trust was thinner than smoke. But the instant Caleb chose not to walk away, something shifted. Fate had stepped in, and neither of them, though they couldn't know it yet, was walking back the way they came. The fire cracked softly in the stove, the scent of pine resin filling the small cabin. Caleb sat at the edge of the bed, carefully cleaning the torn flesh at the Apache girl's ankle. He dipped a rough cloth into warm water, wrung it out, and pressed gently along the wound. Each touch made Ahyoka flinch, her teeth clamped down to stifle a cry. Her dark eyes never left his face, as though waiting for him to change his tone, his gaze, or his intent the way other men had before. Caleb understood that suspicion. He didn't falter for it, instead of explaining himself. He worked in silence. His calloused hands moved with measured steadiness. never straying beyond the wound. When he was done, he wrapped the ankle with clean linen, snug but not cruelly tight, then stepped back, leaving space between them. That small gesture, silent but deliberate, shifted something in her eyes. He set a steaming bowl of stew on a low stool beside the bed. "Eat," Caleb said, his voice low, firm. She stared at the bowl, then lifted her gaze to him, still doubtful. Her trembling hand finally reached for the spoon, bringing a small bite to her lips. Steam rose, coloring her cheeks in the firelight. Caleb turned away, letting her eat without pressure. He knew trust wasn't built with words, it had to be shown, little by little. That night, she didn't sleep. Caleb lay only a few paces away on a blanket on the floor, yet he heard her every movement, the rustle of covers, the uneven breathing, the sudden shift when she sat up in the dark. He didn't speak, didn't stir. He kept his breathing steady, making sure she knew he meant no harm. In that silence, reassurance spoke louder than words. By morning, thin light slipped through the cracks in the shutters. Caleb rose to feed the fire. Warmth spread across the room, and when he turned back, he caught her watching him. For a heartbeat, she didn't hide the curiosity in her eyes. Then, quickly, it vanished, replaced again with caution. "You understand English?" Caleb asked. Silence. After a long pause, she gave the faintest nod. It was enough. He nodded back and asked nothing further. She wasn't mute. She wasn't ignorant. She was silent by choice. It wasn't until supper that she finally spoke. Caleb had just set down a bowl when her voice, husky and strained, cut through the quiet. "My name is Ahyoka." Caleb froze, his gaze meeting hers for the first time. He didn't answer right away, just gave a slow nod. A name small as it seemed meant she had allowed him a place in her world, however narrow. It was the first crack in the wall between them. The days that followed stayed taut with unease. Ahyoka ate, rested, and tracked his every motion. Each time he approached to change her bandage, her body tensed, ready to pull back. But when his hands touched only the wound, then pulled away without linger or demand. The suspicion in her eyes softened. One evening, with the wind shrieking through the timbers like wolves, she stared into the fire and whispered, "They said I was cursed." Caleb turned. "Who my people?" she said, voice breaking. "I was born in drought. Then my sister died. Then the crops failed. They said it followed me, so they cast me out. No one wanted me near them." The words cut deep. Caleb felt them like a blade, because he too knew what it was to be left behind. "I lost someone too," he said at last, his voice raw. "My brother. I swore I'd bring him home. I failed. Since that day, I haven't had a home either." Silence fell again, but this silence was different. It wasn't a wall. It was a bridge, fragile but real, laid between two shores of loneliness. Ahyoka looked at him longer this time, her eyes still guarded, but behind that, something else in acknowledgement, however faint, that maybe she wasn't completely alone in this cabin after all. And Caleb, for the first time in years, felt the presence of another human being, not as a threat, but as a spark, faint and trembling, lighting its way into the dark places of his heart. The next day, mist lifted slowly over Timber Ridge. Pale sunlight slipped through the cabin's gaps, falling across the gray planks of the floor. Ahyoka was able to sit up on her own now, though she still braced herself with one arm and winced when her foot touched down. Caleb noticed but didn't move toward her. He let her try. He knew sometimes trust was built in the space a person was allowed to keep. That morning, Caleb boiled oats, dropped in some dried meat. He set the bowl near her and turned away to clean the dishes. This time, Ahyoka didn't hesitate as long as before. She lifted the spoon, ate slowly but steadily, her eyes not nearly as tense as they had been in the beginning. After the meal, as Caleb pulled on his coat to split wood, Ahyoka spoke softly. "I can help." He turned back, studying her. She didn't look away. "Not because I owe you," she added, "but because I need to do something." Caleb gave a single nod. He carried in a bundle of wood, set the axe down by the chair. He didn't hand it to her, only arranged a few smaller pieces within reach. Her strikes were clumsy at first, too light, too slow. But the sound of wood cracking filled the cabin with something other than silence. Caleb let her be. He didn't correct her, didn't step in. That afternoon, when he returned from the snares with a pair of rabbits, Ahyoka was seated by the fire, mending one of his shirts. Her fingers fumbled with the heavy cloth, but her concentration was sharp. Caleb paused in the doorway longer than he needed to, watching. He realized then that the cabin, once filled only with darkness and wind, now held another rhythm, someone else's hands at work. Trust didn't arrive all at once. It came in small things. That night, when Caleb laid an extra blanket across her legs, she didn't shrink back. When he changed the bandage at her ankle, she didn't flinch from his eyes. She only stared into the fire, letting him work. One night, a gust rattled the shutters. The door groaned. Ahyoka stiffened, panic sparking in her eyes. Caleb stayed calm, fed the flames higher, and said simply, "Only the wind." Just 4 words, but her shoulders eased. She leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes. By the next morning, when Caleb returned with fish from the stream, Ahyoka had the fire already lit. She took the knife without asking and cleaned the catch. Caleb didn't comment, but he saw she no longer waited for him to do everything. She was claiming a place in the cabin. They began to divide the work without words. Caleb hauled wood. Ahyoka swept the floor. He checked the traps. She boiled grain. And slowly, the days carried a steady, quiet rhythm neither had known for years. One evening, when he set a bowl of stew before her, she gave him a brief smile. It flickered across her face like firelight across stone. Fragile but real. Caleb couldn't recall the last time he'd seen a smile in this place. He didn't answer, only nodded. But something within him shifted. Trust, he realized, wasn't some grand moment. It was in a glance not avoided, a hand that didn't pull away when touched. It was silence that no longer felt suffocating, but instead, livable. Another night, when the fire had burned low, Ahyoka asked into the dark, "Why do you live alone?" Caleb lay quiet a long time. "At last," he said, "I lost everything. I didn't want to be near anyone anymore." She didn't reply. Yet, in the hush that followed, there was recognition. She understood the weight of being cast out. She knew the ache of walking nameless in a world that didn't want you. From that shared silence, a fragile thread stretched between them. Ahyoka's eyes lingered longer now when she looked at him, no longer filled with suspicion alone, but with the faint beginning of acknowledgement that perhaps she wasn't entirely alone in this cabin. And Caleb, for the first time in years, felt another's presence, not as a burden, but as a light faint, uncertain, but steady enough to press into the shadows of his heart. Winter on Timber Ridge grew harsher by the day. Supplies in the cabin had thinned salt nearly gone. The flour sack scraped to the bottom. Caleb knew he had to ride down to Dry Creek, though he hated the clamor of people more than anything else. He gathered what he needed, told Ahyoka to keep the fire burning, bar the door tight, and wait for him before dark. She nodded, but in her eyes flickered a trace of worry. Dry Creek lay huddled in the valley, its main street a frozen strip of mud lined with weather-beaten buildings. A saloon, a smithy, a general store, and the post shack nothing memorable but rumor. Caleb tied his horse outside the store and stepped in. The air smelled of cheap coffee and sweat. Heads turned when they saw him, then turned away again. People in Dry Creek knew Caleb Mercer, the hermit on the ridge, a man of few words, hard to know, but never one to cause trouble. Ezra Kane, the shopkeeper, looked up from behind the counter. "Mercer," he said. "Figured we wouldn't see you till spring. Needed supplies. Out of salt," Caleb answered flatly. He moved down the shelves with practiced speed flour, beans, a few bars of soap, more coffee than usual. He picked each item quick, leaving little chance for small talk. But Ezra watched him. "Heard talk," he said in a lower tone. "Tracks up on the ridge. Smaller prints. Folks saying maybe you're not living alone anymore." Caleb raised his head slowly, eyes cold. "Only wolves." Ezra smirked. "Coyotes don't wear soft leather moccasins. Mercer, you'd best be careful. There's a stranger in the saloon. Calls himself a bounty hunter. Asking questions about a missing Apache girl." The air in the store grew heavier. Caleb set down a sack of beans, his voice rough. "I don't know anything." Ezra studied him a long moment before nodding. "I don't want to know. But hear me, men like him don't ask for fun. If he tracks his way up Timber Ridge, you'll have a storm on your hands." When Caleb stepped outside, the creak of saddle leather was loud against the stillness of the street. Yet he felt that the town was different today. Eyes followed him not with simple curiosity, but with danger. He had just loaded his supplies when a voice called behind him, "Mercer." Sheriff Jonas Burke stood there, tall, his hair streaked with gray, eyes calm but sharp as steel. The silver star on his chest caught the dim light. "Still living quiet up on the ridge?" Burke asked. Caleb tightened the reins. "For now." The sheriff walked closer, his tone dropping low. "Word is, an Apache woman escaped a prisoner convoy 3 weeks back. They say she's dangerous, slashed a guard, then vanished into the timber." He paused. "There's a reward out, and bounty men don't need much excuse to spill blood." Caleb's eyes locked on his. "And what do you think?" Sheriff Burke shrugged, studying him. "I think Caleb Mercer doesn't bother with other folks' affairs, but I also think if a bounty man comes knocking at your door, it won't just be you that pays. Sometimes keeping silent is as dangerous as pulling the trigger. For a moment." The two men stood eye to eye, measuring each other in silence. At last, Burke stepped back. "Watch yourself. Mercer, don't give them reason to come looking." Caleb gave a slight nod. No more. He swung into the saddle and rode toward the ridge, his figure swallowed by the thick white fog. The trail back weighed heavy. In his mind rose the image of Ahyoka by the fire. He knew she wasn't just carrying a name, she carried the edge of fate itself. And now, danger had a face, a bounty man, a price on her life, and the restless hunger of human curiosity. When Timber Ridge finally appeared, Caleb felt the wind had shifted. The cabin, once nothing more than a hermit's refuge, had become the hiding place of a secret the outside world would not rest until it uncovered. And he knew then the fragile silence of the past weeks was over. 2 days after his trip to Dry Creek, the wind on Timber Ridge carried a sound unlike the usual wolves or groaning pines. It was the heavy, deliberate cadence of hooves, closing in on the cabin. Caleb had been splitting wood by the porch when he froze. Axe paused mid-swing. A horse came into view, its rider cloaked in black, boots far too polished for mountain country. The man reined up at the door, staring cold and steady. "Mercer." His voice was low, gravelly, dragging the name. Caleb set the axe aside, hand sliding near the Winchester propped against the wall. "I am." The stranger smiled thin, a smile that never touched his eyes. Name's Harlan Pike. I'm here for something that belongs to me. An Apache girl. Folks say she's holed up in these parts. And I hear you've got a habit of picking up strays." The cabin door shifted faintly. Ahyoka, hearing the voice, stood inside with her hand braced on the latch. Caleb tilted his head just enough to signal her to stay silent, then stepped forward, blocking the doorway with his frame. "People aren't property," Caleb said, his voice flat as iron. Harlan's eyes flickered, then darkened. "She was army custody. I was hired to escort her. She bolted, took a horse and a purse with her. The law's on my side. Either you hand her over, or I search." Caleb's jaw clenched. He'd heard lies like these before, from men who used words as shackles. "There's no one here for you," he answered slowly. The air thickened, taut as wire. Only the horse snorted and the wind scoured the ridge. Pike swung down, his boot striking the frozen ground. He came forward, hand sliding lower toward the Colt gleaming beneath his coat. Caleb stood firm, shoulders squared, eyes locked on his every move. "You don't understand." "Mercer," Harlan rasped. "I've put time into this one. Don't make yourself part of the problem." For an instant, time slowed. Inside the cabin, Ahyoka held her breath, fingers curled tight around the knife hidden beneath the blanket. Caleb felt his pulse sink with the wind, every second stretched thin as a drawn bow. Then Pike's hand snapped for his gun. The crack of a rifle split the fog. Harlan's body jolted, eyes wide, before tumbling backward off the porch, crashing hard into the frozen earth. His revolver clattered across the snow, gleaming cold. Caleb stood steady, smoke curling from the Winchester's barrel. His breath came hard, but even, eyes fixed on the fallen man. The door burst open. Ahyoka stepped out, her hair whipping in the wind, clutching Caleb's old rifle. But she hadn't fired. Her gaze darted from the dead man to Caleb, confirming he was still standing. Caleb lowered the Winchester slowly. "It's done," he said, voice hoarse. Ahyoka said nothing. She strode forward, bent, and picked up the Colt from Pike's slack hand. With trembling fingers she emptied the chamber, tossed the cartridges into the snow. The body lay still, blood soaking into black cloth. There was nothing left to say. Together, they dug a shallow grave on the ridge's edge, beneath the pines. Caleb spoke no prayer, raised no marker, just shoveled earth over the man, one load at a time, until the ground was flat again. Back inside, silence pressed heavy. Ahyoka sat by the fire, eyes on the flames. "You killed for me," she said at last, voice carrying both accusation and acknowledgement. Caleb set the rifle back in its place and sat opposite her. He shook his head. "No. I killed so he couldn't take what's mine." The quiet stretched long, longer than winter itself. Then Ahyoka nodded, lips tight but eyes softening. For the first time, she no longer looked like someone hunted. She looked like someone chosen, standing within the circle of protection. Outside, the wind howled on. But inside, two breaths rose and fell together. Harlan Pike had brought death to Timber Ridge, but he had also drawn a line in blood, from this moment. Caleb was no longer just the hermit on the mountain. He was a man who had chosen, who had taken his stand, and there would be no going back after Harlan Pike's death. Timber Ridge fell back into its old silence. Yet inside the cabin, the air had changed. The fire burned brighter, not from extra wood, but because two people no longer looked at each other as strangers. For the first time since she had entered that cabin, Ahyoka sat at the table without bracing herself. She lifted her eyes to Caleb and said plainly, "I don't want to go anywhere else. I want to stay." The words were simple, but they struck Caleb like a bell against stone. He nodded, without flourish. "Then stay. This is home." Winter slowly loosened its grip. Snowmelt ran down the slopes in narrow streams. Birds returned, and pale spring light spread across the ridge. Life, after so much hardship, pressed quietly upward again. One morning, Ahyoka laid her hand on her stomach, whispering to Caleb, "I think, it's begun." He looked at her, silent for a long time, then placed his rough hand over hers. Warmth passed between them, steady and undeniable. Caleb said nothing more than 2 words. "Good then." In his gray eyes. A new light sparked something he thought had been buried long ago, with his brother's body on a distant battlefield. From that day forward, Caleb worked without pause. He cut timber, set posts, hammered boards. His hands split and bled, but there was a rare curve of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Ahyoka watched from the porch, wrapped in his old coat, her eyes following every stroke of the hammer, every beam lifted into place. She saw not just strength in him, but the will to build a true home. When the new room was finished, plain walls, a small window, just enough for a cradle and a bed, Caleb carved a wooden sign. With patient strokes of his knife, he shaped the letters. He hung it above the door. One word, Mercer. No preacher, no vows, no paper. But for Ahyoka, that sign meant more than any ceremony. It was his declaration that she belonged here, that he had chosen her, and that she now carried his name because she stayed. That evening, as spring winds moved through the trees, Ahyoka stepped onto the porch and wrapped her arms around Caleb from behind. He stilled, breath-catching. She rested her head against his back and whispered, "Now I know. I was never cursed." Caleb turned, looked her in the eyes, and said firmly, "There was never any curse, only cruel men who said so." They stood together in the soft gold light, like 2 souls who had walked through shadow and found rest. The days that followed carried a new rhythm. Ahyoka planted beans, onions, and squash in neat rows. Caleb patched the roof and carved a small wooden cradle for the new room. The sounds of birdsong replaced the howl of wolves. Soft laughter replaced the nightmares that once haunted the nights. And when evening came, the fire in the stove snapping and glowing, they sat side by side in quiet contentment. Their happiness was not loud, not boastful, but steady like Timber Ridge itself, weathering storms, standing tall through the seasons. Deep down, Caleb knew his life had shifted forever, and Ahyoka, once cast out and branded cursed, had found her place. In that rugged land, they had built more than a cabin. They had built a family. Spring on Timber Ridge opened like a fresh page. Ice melted into clear streams running down the slopes, bubbling under gentle sunlight. Caleb set posts for a wooden fence around the front plot, while Ahyoka's hands moved steadily, dropping beans, onions, and squash into soft rows of earth. Each furrow in the soil looked like a line of hope, planted not just for food, but for a future neither of them had dared to imagine. The cabin that once stood as a hermit's refuge had become a true home. A new room stood beside the old one, plain but sturdy, with a wooden cradle Caleb had built by hand, the scent of pine resin still fresh. Above the front door, a carved board swung in the breeze, bearing one word, Mercer. A quiet proclamation to the world that this place had an owner, a family, a name. Daily life no longer felt heavy with solitude. In the mornings, Caleb stoked the fire and brewed coffee, while Ahyoka prepared meals from whatever they had hunted, gathered, or grown, by day. He checked traps in the timber and returned with rabbits or a deer, met by her calm gaze and a basin of warm water waiting on the porch. In the afternoons, they worked side by side, mending the roof, weaving baskets, or simply sitting together on the steps, watching the light fade behind the ridge. The silence, once suffocating, had softened into something welcome. Trust now lived in the quiet. Small gestures carried more than words, Ahyoka folding his shirt neatly over the chair, Caleb feeding the fire when she sang an old Apache song in a low voice. Each act, modest and unspoken, wove the thread of belonging tighter. By summer, green rose sprouted tall, squash rolled across the dirt, and the patch of earth pulsed with life. Caleb often stood watching as Ahyoka bent to harvest, her hair dark against the sunlit field. His hands were still hard, scarred, but his gaze was softer now. For years he had lived like a shadow among trees, and now he had this, a woman, a plot of land, a home that no one could take away. Ahyoka, once branded cursed, carried life inside her. The child in her womb was proof that darkness couldn't swallow everything. Sometimes she sat on the porch, hand resting on her belly, and Caleb would sit beside her, laying his own hand gently over hers. He never said much, but the promise was clear: he would guard this family, raise it, and never let them face the loneliness he had known. One evening, as firelight flickered across the cabin walls, Caleb carved another piece of wood. Not a name this time, but the shape of a wildflower growing from stone. Ahyoka asked, "What is it for?" He answered with a quiet smile, "For our child, so they'll know beauty can grow even in the harshest ground." And so the story that began with blood in the dirt now closed with this image: two souls, once lost, sitting together by the fire, building not just a shelter, but a world. Now, friends watching this tale unfold, think on it. What kept Caleb and Ahyoka alive? Was it rifles, strength, or cunning? Or was it the fragile belief that even after betrayal and abandonment, there might still be something worth holding on to? I believe it was that very faith that carried them through. And perhaps it is the same faith we all need in our own lives. If this story stirred something in you, don't forget to leave a word of support for Caleb and Ahyoka in the comments. Do you believe they deserve this new beginning? And if you could guide them, what would you suggest Caleb do next? Should he expand the farm, raise livestock, or bring Ahyoka into town to make their name known? Your thoughts might shape the next chapter of their journey. Above all, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel, so we can keep bringing you stories of the American West stories where even the broken and cast out can find peace, love, and a home. Caleb Mercer, once a lonely soldier, had found his hearth. Ahyoka, once abandoned, had found her worth, and together, on Timber Ridge, they had planted the seeds of a true future. Their story did not end with gunfire, but with the steady beat of hearts in a quiet night, with rows of green under a rising sun, and with the cry of a child soon to fill the cabin's walls. From loneliness and despair, they built a home. And that, dear friends, is the greatest victory a soul can ever claim.